Everybody, and welcome to our March Community Forum. Thank you for taking some time today to spend it with us. This community forum is being held in support for our Asian and AAPI community here at William James College and our families. We're going to open our program today. Dr. Jill Bloom will be reading a statement of solidarity. Dr. Bloom, please.
Thank you. And as co-director of the Center for Global Multicultural and Global Mental Health, I'm really, so pleased and, that the multiple collaborations that are in place here at William James College. And to have events such as this is really extraordinary. Dr. Catherine Vuki, who is part of the CMGMH, couldn't be here today. She's director of the Asian Mental Health Program. So she asked me to read a note from her. So she says, begins to the WJC community. I want to thank Gloria Naranjo from the DEI's office for hosting this community forum. I regret not being able to be there with you today. I have been so disturbed by the increased violence against Asians since the end of January around our Lunar New Year. It is usually a time of joy, but this year was marred by not being able to see our loved ones and compounded by the fear of being physically attacked and robbed. Last week was particularly difficult after hearing 2 elderly Asians were attacked in Quincy near my clinic, South Cove Community Health Center. I worry about both my staff and patients. Some thought it wouldn't happen in Quincy because of the relatively large Asian community. The community feels unsafe. I'm unable to attend this community forum because I'm needed in my clinic to support our patients who have been expressing increased anxiety and fear. I am thankful and grateful for the support from the WJC community, the Center CMGMH, and the Asian Mental Health Program. To any student in need of support or information, please know that I'm here and available to you. In solidarity, Dr. Catherine Vuki.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bloom, for those words, and thank you for sharing them on behalf of Dr. Catherine Vuki. And thank you, President Covino, for creating this space to bring our community together. This afternoon, as I said, we've come together as a William James College family to support our Asian and AAPI family. It's our William James way. I am so blessed to be your Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion because I get to be part of and represent a community of action-oriented leaders. While many institutions of higher learning combat the hateful violence with lengthy statements and affirmations, and while words can carry healing, advocacy, and validation, they also need to be followed by action and change. As a parent, I particularly found useful our parent guide developed by the Asian Mental Health Program to help families address xenophobia, racism fueled by COVID-19. As a staff member, I get to witness the brilliance of our faculty members like Dr. Catherine Vuki, who manifests the teachings of psychology through the form of through an Asian lens. I get to support and champion social justice change agents like WJC's first year student, Kevin Nareen, who recently co-moderated a panel discussion titled Out of the Ivory Tower, Developing Effective Allyship Through an Anti-Racist Framework. Such an amazing job he did in that moderation. And even though we're mostly in Zoom rooms, when I do travel to One Wells Avenue, I enter a community where we have representation. I can walk the halls and know that I'm not the only one who looks like me. When I am hurting and in pain, I know I have allies who will step up and speak out. And if they don't know what to say, they will show up and learn. There is power in voice. There is power in numbers. And there is power in learning. We are a community of action-oriented learners. We are far from perfect, but we are striving to be better and to do better. Our speaker today is family. I've invited my partner, Dr. Roy Kamada, to come share a brief story of Asians in America. As you listen to the story, ask yourselves, who wrote this story? How many competing stories are there? Stories are extremely powerful, but for many of us people of color, our stories are not written by us. Dr. Roy Kamada is an associate professor and chair of the Writing, Literature, and Publishing Department at Emerson College. He is a specialist in British and multi-ethnic American literatures whose interests include poetry, contemporary poetics, and post-colonial, transnational, and diasporic studies. He has received grants from Emerson College, the James Irvin Foundation, Poets and Writers, the Vermont Studio Center, and Breadloaf. He has received the Celeste Turner Wright Award for the Academy of American Poets, the David Noel Miller Fellowship at UC Davis, and a Henry Hoynes Fellowship at the University of Virginia. He is the author of Post-Colonial Romanticisms, Landscape, and the Possibilities of Inheritance. When not mentoring his faculty or attending to his chair duties, he enjoys baking sourdough bread and through COVID has learned how to make kimchi for our family. Roy is also a father of our two wonderful children, Maya and Elliot. Welcome to our William James family, Dr. Roy Kamada.
Thank you, Gloria. I didn't realize you were going to talk about my baking fascinations this summer. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you to Gloria for the generous introduction. I'm honored to be asked to speak to you today. As Gloria noted, I'm a professor of literature. I focus on multi-ethnic American and Anglophone literatures. I've focused on Asian American and African diasporic literatures in my writing and in my teaching. Mostly what that means is that I teach and I write about how stories are told and how language creates meaning for those stories within a historical and cultural context of race, colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And there. When Gloria asked me to speak during a WJC event that was meant to be both educational and healing, as well as community building, I thought I'd start by talking in general about how stories work and how the language that's used to tell those stories determines what the stories mean. Let me give you an example from something that you're probably familiar with, but that is quite far away from the topics we're here to discuss. We all know the story of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy of star-crossed lovers whose families dispute is the unavoidable conflict to their love story. But why has the story become an archetype of love stories? Why is the story one that is returned to time and time again, either as a play, a film of the play, or as a film that has roots in the play? Something like Crazy Rich Asians, which isn't exactly Romeo and Juliet, but I'd suggest is a comic descendant of Shakespeare's story. Anyway, one reason why Shakespeare's play remains a part of our cultural imagination is that the language he employs communicates so clearly the heightened emotional stakes for these characters. When Romeo says here, as you see on the slide, "But soft what light through yonder window breaks, it is the east, and Juliet is the sun," what does he mean? Does he mean that Juliet is a giant ball of gas floating in space, throwing off fire and functioning as the gravitational center of the solar system? No. He's speaking in metaphor. He's saying Juliet is the sun. Juliet is the source of life. Juliet is the source of warmth and brightness and joy and love in his life. The language he uses establishes the emotional stakes of Juliet's presence in his life. But as we all know, not all stories end happily, and not all stories are simply about a tragic teen romance. Some stories are larger and can transcend individual narratives and can become a story about a whole race of people or a whole gender or non-binary gender peoples. So I want to switch gears here and speak a little bit about how the language and metaphors used to tell the story of Asians in America illuminates a complex of contesting narratives about what it means to be Asian. in America. Two recent articles in the New York Times highlight an uptick in violence against Asian Americans on the West Coast, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and in New York City. And as Dr. Catherine Vuki's statement noted, there's also been a number of incidents here in the Boston area. These articles tie the violence to anti-Asian sentiment, driven in part by the former president's proclivity to referring to the COVID-19 pandemic as, quote, the China flu or the Wuhan flu. The article notes that in 2020, there were 28 crimes committed against Asian Americans, whereas in 2019, there had been only 3. The articles cite some specific graphic assaults that were captured on video and subsequently distributed widely on social media. Between March 19th, 2020 and December 21st, 2020, the group Stop AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander Hate, received over 2,808 firsthand accounts of anti-Asian hate from 48 states and the District of Columbia. Between March 19th, 2020 and December 31st, the same group received 126 accounts of anti-Asian hate involving Asian Americans over 60 years old. We know that such sentiments and occasional acts of violence are not something new in American history, but that the xenophobia stoked by the former president as he attempted to appeal to a white nationalist and white supremacist base in this country draws on a history of anti-Asian sentiment that goes all the way back to our country's founding. Here we have the text of House Resolution 40, the naturalization bill enacted on March 4th, 1790. This 1790 Act sets up the new nation's naturalization procedures, the procedures by which someone becomes a citizen. It limited access to US citizenship to white immigrants. You can see here that it's restricted to being a free white person, in effect to people from Western Europe. In the 1880s, we see the rise of an idea of the yellow peril, fear of an Asian invasion, and resentment of the cheap labor coming from China. This paved the way for the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned both new immigrants and existing residents from becoming US citizens. Before the Chinese Exclusion Act, newspapers and politicians pointed to poor sanitation in Chinese neighborhoods and described new immigrants inundating American cities in waves. These points were embraced to justify exclusion, though living conditions in immigrant neighborhoods were more often due to a lack of government services. By 1917, after decades of pressure from anti-immigrant movements like the, quote, 100% Americanism group, the Asiatic Barred Zone Act put a halt to most Indian and Asian immigration. And it wasn't until the Immigration Act of 1965 that race-specific barriers were removed. During World War II, another perfect storm led to Japanese American internment. Editors at newspapers like the LA Times voiced their support for the policy, while war propaganda depicted Asians as crafty and cunning, and depicted Japanese Americans in particular as part of a quote unquote fifth column, secrets, if you would, civilian army that was going to sabotage the American war effort. In this Dr. Seuss cartoon, rows of Japanese Americans line up on the West Coast to collect a brick of dynamite. Quote, waiting for the signal from home, the tagline reads. On February 19th, which the anniversary of which was just celebrated a few days ago, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered more than 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. This is a poster that was posted in San Francisco on May 3rd, 1942, which resulted in, as I said, over 120,000 people going into the camps. In 1942, an LA Times editorial wrote, quote, "This is war. And in wartime, the preservation of the nation becomes the first duty. Everything must be subordinated to that. Every necessary precaution must be taken to ensure reasonable safety from spies and saboteurs so that our armed forces can function adequately and our industrial machinery may continue to work free from peril. The time has come to realize that the rigors of war demand proper detention of Japanese and their immediate removal from the most acute danger spots. It is not a pleasant task, but it must be done and done now. There is no safe alternative. As a race, the Japanese have made for themselves a record of conscienceless treachery unsurpassed in history. Whatever small theoretical advantages there might be in releasing those under restraint in this country would be enormously outweighed by the risks involved. So here is just sort of a timeline of some of the big events that I've touched on. You see the House Resolution 40 in 1790. In 1855, the legislature passed a law entitled An Act to Discourage the Immigration to the State of Persons Who Cannot Become Citizens Thereof, and so on and so forth. Some of this is reversed in 1965 with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which removed immigration barriers for non-Northwestern Europeans, including Asians. And subsequently, there is another sort of larger group of Asian immigration that happens post-1965. In the 1980s, Asian communities in America started to mobilize to fight for their civil rights. The trigger was a murder. In 1982, Chinese-American Vincent Chin was beaten to death in Detroit by two white men a few days before his wedding. These men held him responsible for Japan's powerful auto industry at a time when America was losing manufacturing jobs. The judge in the manslaughter case remarked, after fining the murderers $3,000 and declining to sentence them to any jail time. Wayne County Circuit Judge Charles Kaufman wrote, quote, "These weren't the kind of men you sent to jail." After 9/11, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, many of whom were South Asian, documented scores of revenge-motivated crimes in the US. Among the first killed were Sikh gas station owner Balabar Singh Sodhi in Arizona, and Vasudev Patel and Warkwar Hassan, two South Asians in Texas. Then you had the same thing that you're seeing right now, which is racist rhetoric employed by political figures, which then gets translated into tremendously problematic policies as well as public action. During the 2020 Trump administration, the former president continued directing blame for the virus towards China. A 57-page memo by the National Republican Senatorial Committee included a talking point for politicians to argue that calling COVID-19, quote, the Chinese virus isn't racist. In July, Trump claimed the Chinese government was, quote, fully responsible for concealing the virus and unleashing it upon the world. This is the story they were telling about Asians, that China was to blame for the virus. We can also see the power of language as particular terms were used to frame this narrative. Researchers from the University of Michigan, San Francisco State, and elsewhere conducted a Twitter study focusing on the period between January 1st and August 31st, 2020. They searched tweets that contained the following terms: China, Chinese, Asian American, Asian, AAPI, Wuhan, Kung Flu, Bat, or laboratory. These tweets endorsed or defended the use of racist, stigmatizing rhetoric, such as China virus, Chinese virus, plague from China. Tweets deploying stigmatizing rhetoric were centered around tweets from the former President Trump's account. He tweeted a total of 24 times about China, and those 24 tweets were retweeted 1.2 million times and liked 4.3 million times. The tweets that criticized China were found to mention 9 main subjects: China's response to the pandemic, corruption, the Chinese Communist Party, trade and supply chain issues, human rights, national security, technology, wet markets and wildlife, and the theory that the virus emerged from a laboratory in Wuhan. This is not a new story or a new use of language. Here is some text from the New York Daily Tribune, September 29th, 1854. It reads, if you can't read the graphic, sorry. It reads, "The Chinese are uncivilized, unclean, and filthy beyond conception, without any of the higher domestic or social relations. Lustful and sensual in their dispositions, every female is a prostitute and of the basest order. The first orders of English they learn are terms of obscenity or profanity, and beyond this, they care to learn no more. Clannish in nature, they will not associate, they will not associate except with their own people. The Chinese quarter of the city is a byword for filth and sin. Pagan in religion, they know not the virtues of honesty, integrity, or good faith." The story that was told in the later half of the 19th century was that the Chinese were dirty, disease-ridden, and lacking in American virtue. You can see in this slide from an 1899 cartoon, the suggestion that the Chinese and the Cubans were being hauled up the mountain to civilization. The story that was being told was about the virtues of Western civilization. In this story, or in this ad, you can see a soap ad linking together the themes of Westernness, cleanliness, and civilization. The story that was told last year was the story that China was the intentional source of the disease, and that the disease originated in filth and unnatural conditions, and that the corrupt Chinese government brought the disease to America to weaken our country. The story that was told in the 19th century demonized an entire region of the world and drove racist immigration policies, and arguably was a source of conflict between the West and Asian nations throughout the entire 20th century. The story that was told last year has resulted in an increase in violence in America against Asian Americans. It's the same story. In February, I was still riding the red line to get to work. One afternoon, as I was standing near the door getting ready to get off, a large white man leaned up next to me, staring hard into my face and leering at me with a grin that did not convey joy or happiness. It was a threatening look, and it was one that I had seen before in Charlottesville, Virginia, when I was called a gook and a chink for the first time. I just stared ahead, turned up my earbuds, and jumped off the train as soon as it stopped. It was a passing moment of threat and fear, but it also made me remember the stories my grandmother told me about raising my father in the early years of the Second World War. Here's a picture of my grandmother and my father in 1940. They were happy and proud of their Japanese origins and felt no anxiety or fear in demonstrating those feelings. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, she said, people treated us differently. She recalled being pushed to the floor of a bus. She was called the Jap, and she was constantly worried that something was going to happen to her young son. But then, as now, interventions are made. Protests against anti-Asian violence have occurred all over the country as allies declare their solidarity and stand against racist violence. And in the more personal and quieter fronts, writers, artists, and professionals of all type help to reframe the story so that they can transform a racist taunt about the shape of an Asian person's eyes into an expression of beauty and tenderness. This is a book that came out last year that we just purchased for our children. Well, thank you. That's what I had. I'm happy to talk and be part of the dialogue as it goes forward. But I appreciate you hearing me and inviting me. So thank you.